Hello, welcome back, Professor Timothée O'Connor. Can you hear me, sir? Well, we don't have your voice. Okay, now your mic is on now. Yes. I'm sorry, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yes, it works.
Yes, okay, good.
Hello again, welcome back to our
Thank
sessions.
you.
Today is August the 31st and our 7th session of Sharif International School on Theism. Thank you so much. Previously, we were with you at the subject on 28th of August, Theism and Metaphysical Naturalism as Philosophical Research Programs. Today, the title of Professor O'Connor is concentrated on arguments from the success of science and evil. Am I right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so the stage is yours, sir, and we are all ears. Thank you so much.
Okay, I have opened a file. Can you see that now?
Yes, yes.
All right, excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Today, I do want to remark on two arguments that purport to give evidence for metaphysical naturalism. The first argument is from I'm calling the argument from the success of science, and the second argument is from the widespread, intense, and seemingly random suffering that many humans and animals experience. Both of these arguments have a lot of influence on educated individuals, though the first argument is rarely articulated and carefully assessed by philosophers. It's sort of in the backdrop of their thinking. On the other hand, the challenge of suffering, the second argument, has been endlessly discussed and analyzed by philosophers. Okay, so I have 45 minutes. Obviously, that is not enough time to discuss these arguments at all fully. So my aim here is simply to make a few observations and critical comments on each of these arguments and point out debatable assumptions that they make about theism. I will also note that the data that they draw upon, while viewed in one way, may seem to give a comparative advantage to naturalism, when viewed in another way, pose something of a challenge for it. And so my conclusion is that defenders of both naturalism and theism have work to do when it comes to assessing the import of the success of modern science and the fact of pervasive suffering in our world. I will not try to show which view handles these data better than the other or by how much. That judgment can come only after a much more thorough examination of the issues and questions that I can only touch upon here. But hopefully, what I say will prove to be a sound and helpful starting point. Okay. As we all know, for a long time in human history, it was common to invoke God or other supernatural beings to explain certain natural phenomena, such as violent storms, lightning, mental illness, or plagues. God, or lowercase g gods, were deployed, among other purposes, in, you might say, proto-scientific hypotheses that have been displaced by mature science. Even such a distinguished scientist as Newton, Isaac Newton, in the 17th century, occasionally lapsed into this form of thinking. So a lot of people don't know this, but when Newton put forward his theory of gravitation, his calculations led him to suppose that the planets in the solar system, if left alone, would eventually begin to veer out of their orbits over a very long period of time. But of course, that hasn't happened. The planets have stayed in their orbit. So famously, Newton hypothesized that God occasionally moved them back into alignment. In the 19th century, the physicist Laplace showed that Newton's calculations were mistaken. Okay, so no adjustment was needed by God or anything else. He had simply erroneously calculated the problem. So an apocryphal story has it that the French Emperor Napoleon asked Laplace about the role of God in his understanding of physics, and Laplace was said to have replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." This story is, in fact, apocryphal. It never happened, but it is no accident that the story arose in the 19th century, as this is the century when a great mythology was born concerning the relationship of science and religion. Two prominent American historians, Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper, are credited with helping to launch the myth in the minds of educated Americans and eventually Europeans. Here are, and so then the myth endures to this day in the minds of probably the vast majority of educated Americans and Europeans, and probably elsewhere in the world at this point, including in the minds of religious Americans and others. So here are a few quotes that will give you the flavor of what they wrote. So Andrew Dixon White, in a very long, you can see just the title of his work, tells you how he's thinking about the subject. He wrote that a conflict between two epochs in the evolution of human thought, the theological and the scientific. And then in an essay, he wrote, "A war continued longer, with battles fiercer, with sieges more persistent, with strategy more vigorous than in any of the comparatively petty warfares of Alexander or Caesar or Napoleon." Okay, that was Andrew Dixon White, the first president of Cornell University. Very influential historian. John William Draper, who wrote a standard textbook on the history of science that was used in the United States for many decades in the 19th century, wrote that the history of science is the narrative, the story of the conflict of two contending powers, by which he means the power of the church, and because he's speaking in a Western context, and the power of science. The Catholic Church, he went on to say, had a mortal animosity towards science. Together, historians tell us that, modern day historians tell us that together White and Draper helped shape modern American, European, and others' perceptions in a way that would be completely unrecognizable to people prior to the 19th century. That is, people who lived through these earlier times, it was a myth, right? Modern historians of science all agree that the picture that White and Draper were portraying of this constant battle between religion and science, where science eventually emerges victorious despite all the efforts of religious authorities to suppress it, it's completely erroneous. Through the early modern era, right, in the beginning with Galileo in the early 17th century and even before him, on through the 17th, 18th centuries, through that whole era, systematic experimental study of the natural world was, in fact, substantially motivated by reflective theology, and it was funded by religious authorities to a great extent. Indebted to the earlier periods of intellectual flowering among Muslim scholars, later Christian scholars in the new Western universities of the late Middle Ages, and then on into the 16th and 17th centuries, had a starting assumption that the world has an intelligible order to it, structurally and dynamically, the way it unfolds over time. And they reasoned that it had this order because it was the product of an infinitely wise God. And so they reasoned an infinitely wise God would produce a beautiful, elegant, well-ordered creation. At the same time, they did not suppose that one could deduce its nature by pure reasoning, since God was free to create any of a great variety of possible worlds. And we are in no position to deduce the mind of God. The only thing to do was to observe what he has done, where all science begins, then systematize what was observed in statements of natural law that reveal its elegant order. Their attitude was captured by the important early scientist Francis Bacon's declaration that God had written 2 books, what he calls elsewhere the book of his word, right, Revelation, and the book of his works, the world, the natural world. Boyle, Newton, Leibniz, Maxwell are among the many important later scientists who shared this very perspective on God in relation to the natural world. Now, there of course were flashpoints where theology and science seemed to be in conflict, with Galileo's producing evidence for the sun-centered model of the solar system, and of course Darwin's common ancestry and natural selection account of the origin of species, these being the 2 major conflicts. It is not my purpose to discuss here these complicated matters. As it happens, I'm currently teaching a university course devoted to these and related matters. But there is a great deal of mythology about these episodes. So see the 2 books I put on the screen for you. One is entitled Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths in Science and Religion, co-written by a series of modern historians of science. And the second volume, also a collection of essays by modern historians of science, is called The Warfare Between Science and Religion, the Idea That Would Not Die. It needs to die, but it just won't. But set aside questions of history. But I wanted to mention that because it's so much in the background of everyone's thinking, right? And it fuels the success of science argument for naturalism, I think illegitimately. But if we set aside false history, if the success of science constitutes objective evidence for naturalism as against theism, it would have to be that there is reason to judge that science's success is more to be expected on naturalism than on theism. In general, when you're comparing 2 hypotheses, if you get a bit of data that is what the first theory predicts, it's what you would have expected if the first theory were true, but it's not what you would have expected if the second theory were true, well then that bit of evidence is evidence in favor of the first theory as opposed to the second theory. Sometimes put in a formal way, that PRSS/N, all that is, that's representing in probabilistic confirmation theory symbols, saying the probability of, here I have SS stands for success of science, probability that we should observe the success of science given naturalism on the assumption that naturalism is true is greater than the probability of that we would observe that science is highly successful given theism. Okay, that's the key claim that needs to be true if there's to be a good argument from the success of science in favor of naturalism as against theism. But problem, as I've already noted, many educated theists of the medieval and early modern eras predicted on the basis of their theism that our world would prove to have the kind of deep regularities that are necessary for the physical sciences to be successful. And that prediction is not unreasonable. Would a perfectly knowledgeable and wise being of unsurpassable power see great value in a highly irregular creation? One where there's no sort of ordered patterns to it? That seems unlikely. Human persons can and sometimes do act capriciously, just out of irrational impetus. But such a tendency in us, however much we may value it in ourselves, in limited doses, our ability to just do strange, unmotivated things, it seems inconsistent with perfection of will and intellect. Perhaps the thought is that God, who can do as he pleases, might want to reserve certain sectors of creation or types of phenomena all to himself, such that naturalistic theorizing concerning the events in that sector would be futile. But this seems to reduce God, capital letter G, to a mere God, small letter g. God, if there is a God, is not just one object among others, responsible for certain observable effects while being irrelevant to others, as various small g gods were thought to have been. God gives being to all non-divine reality, moment to moment, at every moment of time. As the medieval philosopher, theologian Thomas Aquinas put it, God is the cause of causes. By contrast, animistic explanations, in terms of spirits out in the woods and so on, really were proto-scientific hypotheses. They suppose one part of the universe as causing what occurs in other parts, like the moon and the tides, perhaps. The thought that God, in addition to creating and sustaining all creation, might also want to act in the manner of a mere spirit and directly control little bits of the universe seems hard to credit. It's hard to tell a plausible story on which God would be motivated to do that. So even if successful science does not give a comparative advantage to naturalism over theism, one might suppose that it makes naturalism itself more plausible than naturalism otherwise would be. So again, expressed formally, you might think that, well, maybe the probability of naturalism, given the success of science, is greater than the probability of naturalism if we were not to have observed that science is being successful. But it seems to me that this claim is hard to evaluate. If we try to consider the vast range of epistemically possible worlds where details vary, but in all of which naturalism is true, are the deeply patterned ones more numerous among those than the worlds that are not deeply patterned? For myself, if anything, I would have thought the reverse. I would have thought that among the possible worlds where naturalism is true, you'd see a lot more chaotic worlds than deeply ordered worlds. But it's hard to evaluate this claim, I suggest. But let's return to the central claim that is needed by the argument from the success of science. That it's more likely that we should observe science being successful given naturalism is true than it is that we should have observed that given the assumption that theism is true. Some people who are inclined to endorse this claim may be thinking this way. Science has taught us to reason about causes and good explanations. And what we have learned through that process makes explanations that appeal to the omnipotent will of God seem less plausible than they had seemed to pre-scientific generations. A version of this thought is found in the British biologist Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, which, at least in the United States, I think has sold more than 2 million copies, and it's just a sustained attack on belief in God. Okay, so Dawkins notes that modern biology and neuroscience teach that natural intelligent designers, namely us, human beings, because we design things, are very complex biologically. And evolutionary biology teaches us that complex living things arise over time from causes that are much simpler. From this observation, Dawkins draws the general conclusion that any possible intelligent designer must be quite complex, and that absent an explanation that shows how the complexity arose from simpler origins is extremely improbable. So, Dawkins reasons, were there an omniscient God, the one thing we can be sure of is that he would have to be very, very complex. And God may not have neurons because God does not have a brain, because God is not material, or a central processing unit made of silicon, such as our computers. But if he has the powers attributed to him, he must have something far more elaborately and non-randomly constructed than the largest brain or the largest computer we know. So, a God who has no causes, as God is conceived to be, right? So a highly complex, ordered thing, such as God, that has no causes, has got to be at least as improbable as, imagine a tornado, a violent storm that goes through a metal scrapyard, where old autos are left to die, and just enormous amounts of bits of metal and so forth. And just imagine a tornado coming through and happening by sheer chance to rearrange all those parts into the form of a modern jet airplane. That is, it's theoretically possible, perhaps, that could happen, but it is very, very unlikely, right? We would never believe, if such a thing happened, we would never believe that it happened just by chance. So basically, Dawkins is saying the existence of a unfathomably complex and well-organized God is very, very unlikely. That's the message of Dawkins' book. But why suppose that what we find, surprisingly, to be the case in the realm of biology would apply to the transcendent source and sustainer of biological reality and its governing principles? God is not a natural object embedded in the cosmos, causing other things by component mechanisms in God that themselves need explanation. In what sense could the high degree of complexity that Dawkins at least envisions as characterizing a let me restate that sentence. In what sense could the high degree of complexity that Dawkins envisions actually characterize a transcendent, immaterial being that necessarily lacks parts? In what sense is God enormously complex in the way that a modern computer or a human brain is enormously complex, given that God necessarily lacks any kind of material parts? And even supposing that fully specifying God's nature would be a very complex description, it might be analogous to the complexity of certain logical or mathematical structures. Complexity in the implications of a very small number of simple axioms and definitions. Think of Euclid's geometry. A few definitions, 5 axioms, and then you can deduce logically from that very elaborate, complex theorems governing various kinds of geometrical objects, right? But the foundations of the geometry are actually very simple. As I noted last time, philosophical theologians have long contended that our complex attempts at description of God actually correspond to a deep but fertile simplicity in God's intrinsic nature. So Dawkins' assumption that God would be just intrinsically deeply complex he hasn't given good defense of it. Okay, whatever ordinary theists may suppose, for ordinary, not terribly reflective theists may suppose all kinds of things about God, as we all know. Philosophical theists have long recognized that the principal ways that God explains contingent reality, his creation, are at the boundaries of that reality, beyond the reach of possible scientific inquiry. For example, its very existence, or the elegance of its most fundamental character, whatever that proves to be on the basis of our best science. Why does the world conform to that most fundamental, elegant character? And the fact that it's suitable for intelligent life. These are the sorts of things one might invoke God to explain. These are questions that are left when science is done, right? Thursday, we will look at 2 other sorts of possible evidence that are similarly located at the boundaries of physical reality, not at this or that component part of physical reality. All right, finally, I want to note that metaphysical naturalism faces one explanatory challenge from the success of science. It can seem implausible that, absent divine guidance, we creatures should have naturally evolved capacities that are capable of reliably plumbing the deep workings of the vast cosmos we inhabit. Such theoretical, think about the theoretical kinds of cognitive faculties that we use to do mathematics, and science. These faculties extend far beyond the basic sensory perception and cognition, right? Simple vision, smelling, right? Hearing, senses, and very elementary reasoning on them that our distant ancestors needed in early human history in order to survive and reproduce. They didn't need the capacity to do theoretical biology or physics or mathematics, right, in order to survive and reproduce. They only needed very simple faculties. And so the thought is, so while there may be a good evolutionary explanation of why we have reasonably reliable senses, vision and so on, and very basic abilities to reason, it's not clear why we should have, why evolution would see an advantage in the ability to do very complex, right? It just wouldn't have an adaptive advantage in the kind of context in which human cognition arose. Therefore, perhaps there seems to be no selective advantage in evolutionary terms, for there being reliable means of uncovering truth, as opposed to being something like idle imagination. But then, the argument goes, evolution gives us reason to doubt the reliability of the very faculties that we use to argue for the truth of evolutionary theory. At one point, Darwin himself expressed a worry that his theory had such an implication. In recent times, American philosopher Alvin Plantinga has developed a challenge along these lines in his so-called evolutionary argument against naturalism. So the naturalist challenge, then, is to make plausible the claim that a highly reliable theoretical cognitive faculties evolved without design, without purposive design. I should mention here, I just say this is a challenge. I should mention that I myself have written an article offering the naturalist a reply to this argument. But the issue is a subtle one that the naturalist needs to address. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay. I turn now to the most often advanced argument for naturalism, or theism, the so-called problem of evil or suffering. Properly speaking, we should speak of not the argument from evil, but arguments from evil, plural, not singular. There has been voluminous discussion of this argument throughout the history of philosophy, and indeed throughout the history of human thinking. Here I wish only to comment on a recently popular theistic response to arguments from evil. So I believe that the strongest arguments from evil against theism begin by arguing that there exists either, this is on your screen, many instances of intense suffering that serve no good purpose. So pointing to particular instances of suffering that seem to serve no good purpose, since God could have prevented them without any negative effect that outweighs the suffering itself, that is just certain kinds of suffering that doesn't seem to benefit anything else. So if God had simply deleted that instance of suffering, then the world would have been better off for it. Or you might point instead to certain especially horrific kinds of suffering that make, sufferings that occur in warfare, right? Or well, it's we don't even want to think too hard right now about the really horrific kinds of suffering, but we're all aware of them. So there are certain horrific kinds of suffering that you might argue make the sufferer's entire life to be on balance of negative value for her. And that would seem to call into question God's goodness to those individuals. Okay? So I think the arguments from evil are challenging for the theist, and I think arguments that begin from one of these two premises tend to be the most forceful type of arguments. But this by itself is not an argument. This is a single premise, right? So to these factual claims, the argument will need to add moral premises to the effect that a morally good God, if God exists, would prevent all pointless sufferings or all kinds of suffering that renders the sufferer's life to be of negative overall value to her. Suppose we grant these moral premises. Why might we be inclined to accept the factual premises, or these premises? Our question is, Why should we accept either of those factual premises? The answer, in its most basic terms, is that, well, look, for a very long time, philosophers, theologians, and other people have tried and failed to come up with plausible accounts of God's purposes for human beings, such that all the apparently pointless suffering actually serves a strictly necessary purpose. And all the horrific kinds of suffering we see are actually, in every case, defeated, you might say. That is, ultimately rendered meaningful to the sufferer. Right? People have tried to tell stories that explain all this in theological terms, and the claim is they failed. They have not given convincing explanations consistent with God's perfect goodness. Well, suppose, just for the sake of argument here, that we also grant the claim that all attempts to make sense of such suffering in morally good theistic terms have failed. What follows? Well, according to the naturalist, while such long-standing failure does not make it certain that theism is false, it does make it very implausible, very unlikely to be true. It is powerful evidence against the theory. Okay. The argument then rests on the inference that you see on your screen here. It goes from the claim that we have not been able to discern a morally good reason for an omnipotent being to permit certain instances or certain horrific kinds of evil or suffering, to probably there is no morally good reason to do so. And since God, if God exists, would have a morally good reason, that means that's evidence that God does not exist. Okay? But there's this implicit inference. Our failure indicates the probable absence of a reason. And the question is this a good inference? Well, one theistic response to the argument disputes this inference. Such so-called skeptical theist, it's an odd term that's gotten used, but you'll see this term if you Google skeptical theism. These are philosophers who grant that it is often reasonable to move. Here's the general form of inference. Notice this was a particular inference, and now this is the more general form of that inference. It moves from I or we cannot see or discern something to probably that something is not there. And skeptical theists grant that it's often reasonable to make this move. The question is when, under what circumstances is it reasonable? So when I scan the shelves inside my refrigerator in my home, looking for a large container of yogurt, and I fail to see one, it's reasonable for me to conclude probably it is not there. My failure to see it is very good evidence that it's not there in that context. However, when I observe an open field from a distance and I fail to see any small insects crawling on the ground in that field, it is not reasonable for me to conclude that probably there are no such insects there. In general, look at the bottom line of that slide, inferring probably X is not there from the fact that I can't see it is reasonable only if it is quite likely that I would see it if it were there. It's not likely that I would see tiny insects at a distance, even if they are there. So my failure to see any insects is not good evidence that they are not there. Maybe they are, maybe they are not. I am simply not in a position to judge. The skeptical theist then suggests that when it comes to our human beings' shared failure to come up with convincing explanations of why God, if God exists, might have permitted certain puzzling instances or certain horrific kinds of suffering to occur, we are in an epistemic knowledge situation more similar to the attempt to see insects in a field than the attempt to see yogurt in a refrigerator. The skeptical theist argues that our ability to discern moral goods is reliable, but only within sharp limits, much as our visual sense perception is reliable but limited. So good for seeing middle-sized objects nearby, like the contents of a refrigerator, poor for judging very small objects off at a distance. And so the skeptical theist suggests that we can discern kinds of moral goods that are familiar to our human experience, right? We can see that it's good to be well loved and cared for, to have activities or projects that enable you to flourish as a person and grow. And we could list all kinds of familiar goods, right? And we can see fairly simple connections among them, right? Doing these things tends to lead to these goods. Doing these other things tends to lead to morally negative outcomes, and so forth. But we have no reason to think that we could imagine the full extent of possible goods that there are, even for human beings. Possible goods, or all the complex connections that may exist, even among goods that we know, because sometimes there are connections over great distances of time, for example. And it's hard for us to see that because we can't see details across time very well because we have very limited cognition. So some goods there might be goods that are experienceable and so imaginable only in a very different environment from ours. Theistic religions commonly teach that our earthly life is only a prelude to a much longer drama. Perhaps our heavenly life involves goods that we cannot now even envision. And even the worst forms of our suffering may be integrally connected to certain future goods for us that are attainable given an afterlife overseen by an omnipotent God, and we have very limited capacity to imagine what God is capable of doing, although we in our finitude just cannot see the connections. And of course we can draw an analogy here. A child typically cannot appreciate complex kinds of value in music or food. Children, simple music, simple food. A beginning chess player cannot perceive the strategic value in a chess grandmaster's decision to sacrifice a valuable piece, because only the grandmaster can anticipate the implications of that many moves in the future. Thus, the skeptical theist denies that the widespread suffering that we see in our world, much of it seeming to serve no good purpose and to be uncorrelated with moral vice, and some of it to be of such negative value, so horrible that one would dread to even live such a life. All this, the skeptical theist claims to be of little or no evidential weight against theism. And she says this because she thinks we should not expect to see what omnipotent and omniscient God is up to in bringing about his ultimate wholly good purposes. So the assumed fact that we do not see this is not evidence against there being such good purposes. Now, I think that the skeptical theist's reply to the arguments from evil has significant force. We have no reason to believe that our moral perception is powerful enough to be able always to guess at the morally good providential strategy of a being of unfathomable knowledge and wisdom who sees beginning to end in a single vision. However, one misgiving about this response is that it proves too much. Our world has many morally bad events alongside many morally good circumstances involving joy and flourishing. It is something of a mixed bag of good and evil. Whatever your assessment of the overall amount of goodness versus badness in it, we can readily imagine worse worlds, much, much worse worlds. Here's one. Here's a simple description of one. This is a world where it's populated by an endless vista of cold and desolate mountain peaks, 1 mile apart, just stretching on forever. On each, there is a human-like person at the top of the mountain, covered in open sores on their body, racked in pain, and shrieking in agony, continuously. Their voices carrying to others on nearby mountains. This scenario has persisted unchanged for many hundreds of millennia of years, and it is all that the sufferers have ever known. And that is the end of the story. Surely, some such scenario, were it to exist, would provide strong evidence for its sufferers that their world was not providentially overseen by a perfectly good and powerful creator. Likewise, a world in which all human persons seemed regularly to flourish, to go from strength to strength, individually and collectively, that would seem to be some evidence in favor of the existence of a lovingly providential God. So, insofar as you agree with those judgments, that suggests that more work needs to be done by the skeptical theist before she can lay claim to having blunted the force of the problem of evil. She must either persuade us that, contrary to initial appearance, even such extreme scenarios are actually no evidence at all, one way or the other, concerning God's existence, or she must articulate and defend a framework on which our world belongs to a non-extreme middle category of possible worlds, such that our cognitive limits with respect to the kinds of and connections among moral goods are crucial in evaluating them. Those limits make it completely inscrutable to us whether those middle worlds are consistent with a beneficent divine providence, even though they do not prevent us from evaluating the relative plausibility of theism with respect to the extreme cases, my really, really bad world and really, really good world. I will close by suggesting that the facts of human and animal suffering may cut both ways for the metaphysical naturalist. It may look like evidence for naturalism, but it may also pose a challenge. If naturalism is true, then of course death ends all for every individual sentient creature. We live our life, we die, and that's it. When we reflect on human history in light of that fact, taken as a fact, it is a pretty grim picture. Widespread, intense suffering, debilitating diseases, frequent famines and starvation, moral horrors on small and large scales, and a whole lot of premature death. The questions for naturalism as a comprehensive worldview are, how is it possible to maintain a reasonable moral hope given such a reality? And how may we maintain a sense of the urgency of moral action to alleviate suffering given that such actions can seem to be mere drops in an ocean of suffering? In short, the question is naturalism consistent with a livable, morally serious outlook? Now, naturalists have tried to answer these questions. I suggest that more needs to be said to make those answers convincing. Thank you.